All right, let's review real quick because we talked about the prologue to the flood, which I labeled as the second rebellion. It's the first 8 verses of Genesis 6. So we're going to be in Genesis 6:9 and try and get all the way through 7:5 today. It's everything that happens up to the point the floodwaters start. So the prologue of the flood in the first 8 verses was the sons of God coming down and cohabitating, shall we say, with the daughters of men, and they birthed the Nephilim. And the sons of God are, of course, God's divine council members, which we've looked at before. So they are celestial beings who are taking on flesh, intentionally rebelling against God and leaving their God-given places of authority and responsibility to go shack up with women. It burst the Nephilim. The Nephilim is a word that I argued came from the Aramaic word meaning giant, which is why they always translate the word as giant. And it shows up twice in the Bible, Genesis 6:4 and Numbers 13:33. There is where they're about to go in and, well, they're supposed to go in and conquer the land of Canaan and wipe out the giant clans. And they say they're too big, we can't do it. And that's why they ended up rebelling against God there and wandered in the desert for 40 years. God said, just go in and fight them. I'll give you the victory. And they said, no, they're too big. The giants are too big. And we talked about the size of the giants being about 6.5 to 6'8" was a typical giant, because an average size for a standard person was like 5 foot to 5'5" back then. So really what's gone on in the second rebellion, and I don't think I worded it like this, but let me do so now, is that God has one family, be it celestial or terrestrial, human or angelic. He has one family, but he's designed those families to function separately in parallel fashion in different worlds. The celestial world has the celestial functions. The human world has the human functions. They were not meant to cross-blend in any way except where God says, do this. And we'll get to some of those legitimate cross-blendings down the line. But for now, just know this is an illegal cross-pollination of celestial and human relationships. God did not approve it. He did not say it. Go do this. That is why it is a rebellion. And here's what happens when you cross-pollinate stuff. You're transgressing God's established boundaries. And when you transgress God's established boundaries, you are unleashing chaos. And that's exactly what happens in the prologue. Everything is so chaotic and so destroyed on earth from this cross-pollination rebellion that God says, you have 120 years and I'm going to wipe you all out. He hasn't mentioned anything about a flood yet, but he says, I'm not going to put up with this forever. I'll give you 120 years, which may be an exact number count, or it may be just you have 3 to 4 generations. Probably 3 generations were counted in 40s. And so he says, 120 years or 3 generations, and I'm going to put an end to this. This is not going to continue. I will not put up with rebellion forever. But Noah, in verse 8, found favor in God's eyes. And what's going on here is just like chapter 1 of Genesis and chapter 2, well, 1:1 through 2:3, you get a big picture narrative of what happened in the creation of the 7 days, and then you get a zoomed in picture of what's going on. And stuff gets repeated, sometimes out of order. If you read Genesis 2, things get created in a different order than in Genesis 1. We didn't really cover that, but it does happen. And what you have here in chapter 2, starting in verse 8, is you get a repetition of what God has already said. Everything's corrupt, everything's bad. Now I'm going to destroy it. And you get a parallel storytelling. And what goes on with Hebrews is that they do parallel storytelling all the time. They don't just tell you one thing. They often tell you a big picture, and then they tell you another picture, and it's supposed to take a step in the direction of what they want you to know. So we'll cover a little bit of that today. So the Genesis flood is chapter 6 all the way through chapter 9. We're going to cover through chapter 7 to verse 5 today. But here's a big idea, an overarching notion to what the overall flood narrative is about. In the flood narrative, Genesis 6 through 9, we see God justly judging humanity's corruption, but remaining committed to graciously preserving a remnant via the seed bloodline. We've already covered how Noah is a descendant of Seth. And Seth is the promised seed of Genesis 3:15. At least his bloodline is taking on that responsibility. So via Noah, a remnant is preserved, and he's going to work on earth to restore Eden again. So as much as he's committed to judgment, he's also committed to saving. Both can be true at the same time. We'll talk a little bit about how that is today. Before we jump into the text itself, I just want to point this out to you before we read it. There's a lot of language here in 6 through 9. A lot of it that's designed to connect us back to Genesis 1. If you were reading this in Hebrew, you could not miss it. If you're reading it in English, you might miss it. So let me draw your attention to one of the major things of the text we're going to read today. Whenever God creates in chapter 1, he saw that it was good. He sees it. There's this notion of God looking out at things in chapter 1 after he's done something. But now it's after this celestial and terrestrial rebellion that God looks out, and now he sees what? How he saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth. Verse 5. Now the land was corrupt in God's sight. Verse 11. And then finally in verse 12, God saw how corrupt the earth had become. So now he's looking out, and he's not seeing something and declaring it good. It's the exact opposite. The world has been flipped upside down from God's intentions. And you're supposed to read that and get that picture by a simple little word, or at least the phrase, God is seeing the way things are. But Noah found favor in the eyes of Yahweh, verse 8. So even there, it's giving you description of someone actually God looking out on somebody and seeing this person himself is not the corrupt person. Hello there. So Noah alone has found favor in the eyes of the Lord, but everyone else is corrupt. Almost everything is linguistically connected back to Genesis 1. So you're meant to read the flood narratives in light of Genesis 1. The state of things in Genesis 6 is the inverse of what God wanted in Genesis 1. People will not teach you to read the flood this way. So maybe you actually want to have a theology and an idea of what creation was in Genesis 1 if you're going to undo creation in Genesis 6, 7, 8, and 9 and recreate. What did God create the world out of in 1, 2? He looks down, he surveys things, he sees things, and it's primordial chaos in the form of what? The primordial waters of chaos. He holds them back, and out of that he creates the world. That's the story of Genesis 1. We don't read it that way, but the ancients weren't concerned with material creation. Guess what? The story of the flood is God unleashing those waters he deliberately held back to destroy the world, and then out of those same waters recreate it again. That's the big picture of how we're supposed to view things, but they're happening in opposite order. Instead of God creating and then looking and declaring it good, he looks out, he sees it's corrupt, so he's going to uncreate it and then recreate it, and then he'll have something to say after he recreates it. So what is the flood? The flood is God hitting the cosmic reset button. By unleashing chaos against the chaotic and rebellious and corrupted humanity and all the society that they have built, forcing humanity to restart through Noah's family, so that humanity would at least have a chance at redemption. And this is the big point. You get judgment theology. Yahweh, as the creator, is also judge, and he judges the corporate sins of humanity. We are a radically individualized society. We care nothing about other people. We ask only the questions that have to do with me. And here God is saying, at every level of human society, they are corrupted. So I will destroy every level of their human society and remake human society from Noah and his sons. There is such thing as corporate communal judgment. Israel is sent into exile as a people. God doesn't just round up the individuals and say, okay, you pass, you fail, you go. It is pass and fail as a group. And if the group fails, even the righteous can go into exile. Like Ezekiel, like Daniel, like Jeremiah. You get this all the time. But you also get a remnant. And this is where we get remnant theology from. A remnant theology is where is the belief that Yahweh is always going to save a small portion of humanity to begin again every time he judges the corporate group. So despite the fact that he will destroy the world, he will use humanity to recreate it. He is still committed to his Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 creation plans to use humanity to be his means of ruling the world, which means he has to save someone. He will not give up. There is no plan B. Noah is the only person he looks out and says, "You're not corrupt. You find favor in my eyes. Therefore, I'll save you." So you right here in Genesis 6 chapters into the Bible, you get judgment and remnant theology, which is going to follow you all the way through the Bible, all the way to Revelation. Even before you get out of Genesis, Abraham is bartering with God. You're going to destroy all of Sodom and Gomorrah? Oh, crap, my nephew Lot lives there with his wife and daughters. But if there's 50 righteous people in the city, and barters God down from 50 to 10, and then God just saves Lot and his wife, and well, his wife doesn't make it out, but that's her fault. Lot and his daughters before he destroys Sodom and Gomorrah, because he always saves a remnant. Not from the judgment, as if Lot could stand there and not get hit with burning sulfur, but from the judgment in the sense of flee into the mountains. He's not going to save Noah, his sons, and all their wives by saying, "Don't worry, stand on this rock and I'll flood the world and you won't have to go through the flood." God saves the remnant through the judgment. God preserves a faithful people despite sending them into exile, and he rebuilds again. He does this to this day. You think everyone that walks into a church building is safe from the wrath of God? I tell you, nay. But despite all the people who come for all the wrong motives and have no faith in God, out of that, God is still working to preserve a remnant. That one day when he brings a cataclysmic destruction of the world on a planetary wide scale, one final judgment, he'll preserve his remnant through it. So that's big idea stuff for the flood. So let's read the text. Genesis 6, starting in verse 9, says this. "This is the account of Noah and his family. Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and full of violence. God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people on earth had corrupted their ways. And God said to Noah, I am going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I am surely going to destroy both them and the land." It says earth. I'm going to use the translation land. I think that's better. "So make yourself an ark of cypress wood. Make rooms in it and coat it with pitch inside and out. This is how you are to build it. The ark is to be 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. Make a roof for it, leaving below the roof an opening 1 cubit high all around. Put a door on the side of the ark and make lower, middle, and upper decks. I am going to bring floodwaters on the earth to destroy all life under the heavens. Every creature that has the breath of life in it. Everything on earth will perish, but I will establish my covenant with you. And you will enter the ark, you and your sons and your wife and your sons' wives with you. You are to bring into the ark 2 of all living creatures, male and female. Keep them alive with you. 2 of every kind of bird, of every kind of animal, and of every kind of creature that moves along the ground will come to you to be kept alive. You are to take every kind of food that is to be eaten and store it away as food for you and for them. Noah did everything just as God commanded him. And Yahweh said to Noah, Go into the ark, you and your whole family, because I have found you righteous in this generation. Take with you 7 pairs of every kind of clean animal, a male and its mate, 1 pair of every kind of unclean animal, a male and its mate, and also 7 pairs of every kind of bird, male and female, to keep their various kinds alive throughout the earth. 7 days from now, I will send rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, and I will wipe from the face of the land every living creature I have made. And Noah did all that Yahweh commanded him. So let's talk a little bit about the structure of this story just briefly. The first part of verse 9 is the intro to the new section. We talked about this already. This is the account of Noah and his family. In Hebrew, the word is toledot. It structures the book of Genesis. There are 10 sections after the creation account. We've already seen this is the account of Adam, and then it gives us his bloodline through Seth, down to Noah. Now this will be the bloodline through Noah, and we will get his bloodline down to Abraham as we move towards chapter 12. So we know we're entering a new part of the story, which is why I put verses 1 through 8 as an entire prologue together. You can pick it up here and know you're in a new story, a new narration. There's a new plot going on. We're going to get new details, stuff like that. And so maybe the question we need to ask is, what do we know about Noah after reading these passages? So there are 3 things we discover about Noah. They're pretty simple. He's righteous and blameless among his people. And a lot of people look at that and they freak out. They say, Noah was sinless? No. This language has nothing to do with being sinless. That's stupid. Don't freak out and read your Bible overly literal. The language here is merely that Noah possessed the actual qualities that make him acceptable to God. He has faith in God. He is faithful to God. He is allegiant and obedient to God where nobody else of his generation is. And so he gets called righteous and blameless. That's just a phrase that just means he serves God and no other, which is, in addition to, he walked faithfully with God, which says both the same thing as before, but also it ties us back to Enoch in chapter 5, because Enoch walked with God and then was no more, for God took him. And it says multiple times in that section, Enoch walked with God. So they're giving you Noah is Enoch's great-grandson, I think. The author is trying to tell you Enoch is the best guy possible. Noah is just like the best guy possible that I've already mentioned. But instead of God taking him, God's going to use and preserve him through this catastrophe and judgment to come. Also, he had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. They'll become more important later on. So if Noah is so good, what about the people of his time? What are they like? Well, what do we know about the world of Noah's day? The earth and the land, which I think land is probably a better translation for us. Because when we think of earth, just like we talked about last week, our cosmology is about a planet. Yeah. They didn't understand what a planet was. So when we say earth and we're talking about a planet, they had no concept of that. They had the concept that the land was a big flat disk and a relatively small continent in the ancient Near Eastern world. And I think if we translated land and remind ourselves that's what they considered to be the entire world, we would understand it better. So the land that humanity has spread out on has become corrupt, which means every aspect of human existence has been twisted against God's intention. That word is repeated several times, and it is trying to encapsulate this idea. Again, it is the reverse of Genesis 1. God set everything up good, and humanity is step by step undoing it. And thanks to the sons of God coming down and teaching humanity how to corrupt themselves, they've accelerated humanity's own destruction. Let me teach you about metal crafting. Let me teach you about war. Let me teach you about seduction. Let me teach you about illicit sex. Let me teach you about all the things that you need. Hey, worship me. Let me teach you how to worship idols instead of worshiping God. All this corruption, all of this stuff that is inherent in the prologue, if you can read it like an ancient Near Eastern person, is being recapsulated in one single word here, corrupt, at every level of human society. From the greatest down to the least, from the richest to the poorest. The world is flipped upside down from God's intention, and it's become full of violence. The opposite of God's intention for humanity to live based on love. This idea that humanity was meant and was brought to the garden to serve and to keep the garden. And instead, they've completely corrupted themselves from the first and now second rebellion, accelerating the first rebellion, so that humanity is doing all the wrong things in and for creation. To each other, to themselves, and to the world, and to God. The idea of this indictment is that humanity has gone beyond the tipping point, that they're not savable anymore. So if God's going to save humanity, this generation cannot be part of it. It is that corrupt. It is the mindset of Cain and Lamech. Cain, who would rather kill his brother than own up to his own faults. Lamech, who would rather enslave his wives and boast about killing a man just for wounding him, which may be nothing more than he insulted me, so I murdered him. If Cain is avenged 7 times, Lamech 77. He's boasting about it. That attitude has sunk in. That attitude has gripped all of humanity to corrupt them, except for Seth's line via Noah. God's joy at creation has turned to pain and grief, which we already saw in the prologue. God wasn't angry at mankind, he was heartbroken at mankind. That's what generally leads to anger. When you're the most angry, you're usually the most hurt. If you think about it, anger is what psychologists call a secondary emotion. It's not anger so much as it is hurt. It's the same thing with God, because we're made in his image. God's not exactly angry. He's hurt by humanity's habits, choices to go against him. But he's dedicated to saving humanity, so he has to do something about it. Humanity is like an infection running so deep that the only thing that they can do is turn the world off and on again, or else humanity won't be saved at all. So he's reached such a state of corruption and violence, some anti-God existence, that what is God going to do? He's going to hit the cosmic reset button, turn the world off and on again. God judges humanity's apex wickedness. God always has a limit that he's willing to delay judgment for. But whatever his limit is, and we don't exactly know what it is, humanity as a whole has reached this in their wickedness, in their corruption, their violence. And so God is going to return the world to a pre-creation state, and then he's going to recreate the world. The flood waters he held back in their cosmic ideas, putting a dome around the world and bringing the earth and the land out. He's going to let those cosmic waters come back and destroy the world and then recede again, hold them back again, and recreate through Noah. So in Genesis 1, God tames the waters. He holds them back. He takes the anti-life and he creates life, living things out of it. He will now unleash cosmic chaos to destroy the world. His judgment works like this. You have so unleashed chaos in my world. Think the Joker. You have so unleashed chaos in my world that I'm going to unleash chaos greater than you to put an end to you. And afterwards, I'll recreate the world out of the waters. I'm going to give the world a second birth. So even now, in the beginning chapters of the Bible, we already get this motif of new birth coming along. Maybe that's one way that you could read the story and the recreation ideas and motifs. And he means this, he's going to recreate society, human society, through Noah's 3 sons. So once again, we get a creation story given to us in 3 through 9 that has nothing to do with material, physical creation. Nothing whatsoever. So thinking that way is not going to get you very far. Okay, so let's start in verse 13 and break down God's words to Noah. Verse 13, God says, I'm going to destroy everything. Verse 14, so build an ark. What is an ark? Ark is a box. That's it. It comes from an Egyptian loanword, that tiva. It's not a boat. We're going to look at some artist renderings of what they think the ark is, and how many of them, if you just Google them, create like a boat-like structure. Probably wasn't a boat, because an ark is a box. The reason it's a box and not a boat is because the ark is not going to be in control by the humans. They're not going to navigate the waters of chaos when God unleashes them. They're not going to ride the storms like a British soldier when the empire was strongest. They built navies and they conquered a lot of land and controlled it because of their navies. They're not doing that. They're just going to trust God and exist in the waters for a year and some change, believing that God will ultimately see them through chaos and water. Now, this picture of the ark here, I think, is probably as accurate as you're going to find. This is from the 2014 movie with Russell Crowe called Noah. You see how it's just a big square? That's much more in line with what I would imagine the ark to be. Build a gigantic box. not a boat. It doesn't curve on the bottom to try and move with the waves. It's just going to stay, for the most part, flat and ride on top of the waters, which you can kind of see in the second half of the pictures there. So the size of the ark gets mentioned in verses 15 through 16. This picture just tries to get it a little more exact because Hebrew measurements in cubits is approximately 18 inches, but it was the width of whoever's building their forearm down to their hand. It's unclear sometimes, are they including their whole hand from like elbow to fingertips, or are they just doing the wrist? It's very unclear. And people were allowed to do it one way or the other. So you could approximate it 450 feet long, 75 feet high, and 45 feet wide, an 18-inch opening, 1 cubit, just below the roof for a window. So there you go. That's the approximate listings right there that you can see. And this is all information you could just Google. It's comparable now to a small cargo ship, but this was an enormous size structure for something in the ancient world. All the other ancient world creation stories, and there are plenty, they don't build ginormous structures because usually it's only a handful of people, and sometimes they don't take animals with them. They just take seeds and plants. And so you can kind of get a sense of roughly 500 foot long and how it's about half the length or 2/3 the length of the Titanic if you compare it with other stuff. Here's a picture of it just compared with the football field. It's about the length of a football field and a half, roughly 150 yards of football field. So if you notice the overlap, that 10 yards in the end zone are overlapping there, it comes out to about 150 yards, football field and a half. Verse 17. Verse 17 is the first time God actually mentions a flood. He's mentioned judgment coming since like verse 5 of this chapter. But he hasn't actually said, I'm going to make it a flood. And that this flood is going to wipe out all life under heaven. Every creature that has the breath of life in it, everything on the land will perish. And I've highlighted this for you because what we're going to do next week is we're going to have to decide what does all and what does every actually mean. Because there are plenty of places in the Bible where it uses this language and then it turns right around and it says, but it wasn't everything. We'll look at some of those passages next week probably if we have time. Everything on the land will perish. So these phrases are not designed to say every stinking bit of life that wasn't in the ark died. The idea is trying to tell a story of a totality of judgment and destruction. Everything that could be experienced in the human world goes bye-bye. It's not about accuracy. It's about outcome. The entire world that Noah and his generation knows is going to be destroyed. That's all. It doesn't have to mean every living creature in existence. Don't take your precise ideas and language and impose it back on them. They didn't think that way. But, verse 18, I will establish my covenant with you. So this is the first mention of the term covenant in the Bible. For now, know two things. A covenant is a legally binding contract between two or more parties. When they use the phrase, and when God used the phrase, he says, I am telling you exactly what I am dedicated to. I am going to do this, and I swear it under blood oath. Covenants were not usually private things, because if nobody can hold you accountable to it, it means nothing. If you say, this other person, Zane and I had a covenant, he broke the agreement, and nobody else knows about it, they just have to take your word for it, which is why covenants were not typically done privately. And that's a big deal because we typically make these private agreements in our day and age, and then when somebody breaks it, we're like, what do? You get taken to court because you made a binding legal agreement with somebody. And some courts will honor verbal contracts. Most courts won't throughout the world. But when God says, I will establish my covenant with you, he's not making just a verbal contract that he can later back out of. He is binding himself to this stuff. And just note that this is actually a future thing he says he's going to do. Until then, verse 19, bring into the ark 2 of all living creatures, male and female, to be kept alive. Verse 22, of every kind of bird, every kind of animal, domesticated and undomesticated. So this is all the creatures created on day 6. It's basically how they classified mammals, what we would call mammals. Genesis 1:25, in verse A it says wild animals, in verse B it says livestock. So that's their two halves of one group that we would call mammal. Domesticated and undomesticated land-dwelling mammals. Every kind of creature that moves along the ground, that's the kind of how we would classify and think of reptiles and insects. 125 verse C says it's a single classification. We would probably divide them up differently, but you get this idea here. Every kind of animal, every kind of creature that moves along the ground. Slightly different groupings from how animals are represented in Genesis 1. Birds, all land animals, and all reptiles and insects are what's referenced here, and it creates a 3-tiered classification implying all the living creatures that an ancient Hebrew would know about. You think maybe there's creatures they didn't know about? Would they still come to Noah to be kept alive? I don't know. But this is a Hebraic story to Hebrews. Non-Hebraic things don't need to be taken into account in the story. So their classification of domesticated and undomesticated land animals, reptiles, things that move along the ground that humans wouldn't necessarily tame and keep as pets, so everything that in the Hebrew mind they would think of is supposed to be a part of the ark. And also don't forget to bring enough food to feed them all. So typically when you see pictures like this, or pictures like this is what Noah's Ark is about. You see all these animals marching towards them. They're coming 2 by 2. And it's supposed to be iconography. It's supposed to be able to tell you this. And I have no idea where they're getting this picture of Noah's Ark. It's like a big house built on a boat. Again, the ark, not a boat. But you don't have to take the language as saying, they will come to you to be kept alive, as necessarily saying, oh, don't worry, they're going to march right up to you. Maybe they actually had to go out and capture some of these things. They had to build the ark. Why wouldn't they have to do more? So Noah did everything as God commanded him in verse 22. So Noah likely put in a lot of hard work for sure, but it's also his sons. He probably hired people to help build the ark. There's 120 years before God brings judgment. No idea when he actually starts talking to Noah about this, so we don't know how long he had to build the ark. Maybe he had the whole 120 years. But here's a picture of Noah holding the paper and somebody else is cutting the wood. And you see the ark in the background and stuff. You don't ever have to take language of saying so-and-so did this to necessarily mean he did it all by himself. There's plenty of language when they build a tabernacle or where they build a temple. All the credit is given to essentially one person. But it doesn't need to be read that strictly and that literally. It's a summary statement. So collecting and capturing animals was probably a part of it. I'm sure some animals came to them, but I'm sure they had to go out and capture a lot more. They had to grow the food, collect the food. Why would that not apply to the animals? But the verse itself is a summary statement that's designed to skip ahead in time. It just says, God said all of this, Noah did all of that. Oh, and by the way, God's going to talk again. Verses 1 through 5, God gives some last-minute instructions before the flood begins. 7 days and 7 pairs get counted off in this phrase. We have to wonder, is God giving him further instructions? Is it the same instructions from when God spoke before? Why are there 2 different conversations going on here? Here, there's a numerical grouping. Go into the ark, because in 7 days I'm going to bring the floodwaters. And take 7 pairs of clean animals. What's a clean animal? Because for the first time we're getting this distinctive language. Clean animals and unclean animals. We've gotten 2 first in Genesis 6 and 7. The first mention of a covenant and whatever that means, and the first mention of clean and unclean animals. What is that going to mean to an ancient Hebrew? A clean animal is any animal used by the Hebrews for sacrifice, and an unclean animal is any animals they did not use for sacrifice. You could use all sorts of animals. You could use sheep and you could use lamb, but you could use goats. You could use oxen. If you were rich, you were required to use oxen because they were the highest form. But if you were really poor, you used birds. Birds are multiply a lot faster and they're a lot more numerical, so they're cheaper. So the poor people were allowed to come and offer sacrifices of God of just quick birds. This is what you see Joseph and Mary doing on Jesus' 8th day when they bring him to the temple for circumcision, because they were poor. So they don't even bring a lamb or a goat, kind of mid-sized animals. They bring the poorest lot, birds. But here you just get clean and unclean. And then you get verses 1 through 3, go into the ark, 7 pairs of clean animals for sacrifices, 7 pairs, or 1 pair of unclean animal, and then 7 pairs of every bird. And it's very unclear because 7 here of birds, you could use birds as sacrifices. Are you supposed to read the implied, these are the clean birds you would use for sacrifices? There's good reason to read it either way. I'm going to actually land on, I think these are actually the birds that would be used for sacrifices. Because it's meant to be grouped together. It is mentioned here as the last thing to do before getting into the ark, because the story is structured so that the sacrificing of the clean animals is the first thing Noah does coming out of the ark. So he brackets off the instructions of God separately to make it the very last thing with God's instructions to get in, and wait so that the very first thing that they come out is about the clean and sacrificial animals. So it's a different idea of storytelling than what we're used to. And Noah did everything that God commanded here. 7 days from now in verse 4. Did it take 7 days to load all the animals, or did humans have to get on board and wait 7 days? It could be either one. The point is, I think the point of the story is about trusting God. So I think get on board and wait 7 days makes more sense. Because it's one creation cycle. 7 days is one creation cycle in Genesis 1. So for the last creation cycle, don't be part of the outside world. Get in and stay there. And trust me. Exercise some faith here. The idea is be ready. One more creation cycle and then I'm going to end creation itself. That's how I've paraphrased it. This was an act of faith as much as building the ark was. And that's the point. God's presence is now with the people on the ark and not with the rest of the world. For 1 week, one creation cycle. And Noah did all that God commanded him. So Noah trusts God. So just to back up and give us a little bit of structure to the storytelling here, to these passages, because it doesn't make any sense to us, but sometimes if we just look at the structure differently, we can follow the story better. Verse 9 and 10 gives us details on why Noah is elected, chosen by God to survive. 11 and 12 give us details on God's election to destroy. Then 13 through 21, God's first instructions to Noah. And then verse 22, Noah's response of faithfulness to God. Then God's second instructions to Noah and God's response to faithfulness to God. By giving us 2 halves to one story, their parallelism and their repetition emphasizes Noah's faith. That's all. Hebrew parallelism marks the structure of the story throughout this section. It's just the same in Genesis 1 and 2. You don't have one creation story, you have 2, designed to tell you 2 different things. You don't just have a prologue telling you the world's corrupt, it tells you how the world is corrupt, and then it tells you, starting in verse 9, hey, God looked out and saw how corrupt the world was. They're trying to be emphatic. They're trying to be clear so that you can't miss the point. God's upset and is going to destroy the world. But Noah is a passive player in the story. He doesn't say anything yet. He'll speak at the end of chapter 9. But what he has to say is not the best, especially if you're his grandson. Anyways, the story is told in such a way that if you're a Hebrew missing this, you can't miss the details. Noah's the best of the worst. He's really, really good, and the world is really, really bad. So multiple times God talks to him, and multiple times he obeys God. And he gets on the boat, and now they're just waiting. And the floodwaters haven't even come yet. They're just sitting there waiting and trusting God. And that is a very important aspect of what it means to actually trust God. Remnant theology is often about just waiting for judgment to fall, knowing it's coming, knowing you can't avoid it, and trusting God regardless, knowing that God is going to destroy something. Amos 3:7, Amos the prophet says, the sovereign Lord doesn't do anything without revealing his plans to the servants, the prophets. And he's speaking there in the context of judgment. And he's saying God always tells people when he's going to destroy the world, when he's going to destroy a people. He sends out people to try and save a remnant. You want to be part of the remnant? You might want to get busy listening to God when he speaks and then do as he's spoken before he sends judgment, just like Noah does. Do this and you can survive judgment. Not escape it, but survive it, because God is both just and merciful. He will always punish sin, but he will always cry out to humans to repent so that he can save some sinners. A remnant, a very small group of the overall. And although most people will reject the call to repentance and would rather face their judgment falsely, believing that the judgment will never come anyways, a remnant will always be preserved to rebuild after judgment comes. And sometimes you can do nothing more than hold on through the judgment. So be part of the remnant that will survive the next destruction of the world by believing that Jesus is king and turn from your sins.